Today on Interviews with the Disruptors, we'll be talking with someone who spent 4 decades fighting to keep American democracy honest. Trevor Potter is a Republican, a former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, general counsel to John McCain's 2 presidential campaigns, and founder of the Campaign Legal Center. He was also the real-life lawyer behind Stephen Colbert's Super PAC, a comedy bit that ended up winning a Peabody Award for journalism because, besides getting laughs, it explained how dark money works in politics better than any journalist had. Today, we get into billionaires buying elections, a Supreme Court awash in undisclosed gifts, and whether Trump can pull off a hijacking of the midterms. It's a conversation about power, money, and whether the idea of America, having made it to 250, can make it to 350, more or less intact. I'm Martin Puris, he's Trevor Potter, and welcome to Interviews with the Disruptors. Good morning, Trevor.
Good morning, Martin. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks for being with me. Before we talk about billionaires buying elections and government ethics, that's an oxymoron, I have a couple of questions I am dying to ask you. First, given your relationship with the late Senator John McCain, I just have to ask, if the senator were around today, what would he be thinking? What would he do? And would he even be a Republican?
That's a great question. I think of my relationship with the senator, and it included a scene where I had written to the Federal Election Commission on his behalf. I knew what he thought. I had not cleared it with him. And afterwards, he got some blowback, and I went to see him in his office, and he looked at me. And in the coldest possible voice, he said, "Don't ever pretend to speak for me without checking with me first." So it's even harder under these circumstances to speak for him. But I think it's pretty clear where he stood. He thought of himself as a Theodore Roosevelt Republican and an independent reformer Republican. He had opposed a number of Trump's initiatives in the Senate. I think the question is, has the Republican Party in his state, Arizona, moved so far away from him that it would have been difficult to remain in the Senate? After being the Republican nominee in 2008, he had a real battle in 2010 in his home state. He'd always been very popular. But as his political advisors told him in that election in 2010, it turns out that you used to have 70% approval ratings across Democrats, Republicans, and independents, but now Democrats have discovered you're a Republican, and therefore your numbers are a lot lower in the Democratic side.
That's funny.
And then in 16, again, he won handily, but he would have been up in 22. And would the party have put up with him? I mean, part of what we've seen in the Senate is independent-minded Republicans, not as independent as McCain, I think, being ridden out, pushed out in party primaries, threatened with challenges and retiring. Mitt Romney comes to mind in the most recent round. So he would have been, I think it's safe to say, appalled by what we're seeing, and he would have been a strong voice against it. Whether he would have been seen as still in the Republican Party or more like Theodore Roosevelt having gone off and created a bull moose party, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I was a Republican. I was chairman of the Young Republicans, and I worked with H.W. in both campaigns. And a friend of mine, Bob Schrum, who you probably know,
Sure.
and I were good friends, are good friends. And one night, in my defense, I said, I'm a Rockefeller Republican. And Shrummy said, right, there are no more of those. It means you're a Democrat.
Well, you and I both got our start then, at least mine was in the George H.W.
A great
campaign
man.
as well.
A great man. So, one more McCain question. It seems to me that Lindsey Graham was an unlikely friend. What was that friendship like?
Oh, I think he was a very likely friend. he, first of all, I was fortunate to know him through the McCain connection. He was very smart. It's hard to use the past tense. He understood politics. He was personally charming and witty and fun to be around. And I think he was effective as a collaborator with McCain on a number of issues. We forget, but he was an early proponent of cap and trade and worried about climate change. Obviously strong on foreign policy. I think a lot of that came from his McCain connection. They had worked together in the Republic of Georgia when the Russians were pushing there, and then certainly in Ukraine. He was everything McCain liked in terms of being smart, well-read, caring about the world, interested in learning. But after Trump was elected and Lindsey showed that he wanted to be able to keep his lines of communication open to the White House and the new administration, it's clear and pretty public that McCain disagreed with him on that and didn't understand why he was doing that. And I know after his death, Cindy and Lindsey had conversations about where he could take a stand and what John would have thought. But as Lindsey himself said, he wanted to be relevant, and that meant having access to the president. And Lindsey said, I can't advise him on foreign policy if he won't talk to me. So he saw that relationship as essential to his remaining able to influence policy in the Senate. And I think McCain, while he was there, made it clear that there was another avenue of more direct opposition, but that's not the one that Lindsey thought would ultimately be effective. And I think, looking back, it's undoubtedly true. If Lindsey had taken the McCain approach of opposing Trump publicly and repeatedly and had not sought a back-channel relationship, it's likely that Trump would have supported an opponent in his Senate primary, and Lindsey would have been an ex-senator at this point.
So do you think he liked Trump? Is that a fair question?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I will say that they appeared to enjoy playing golf together, and I think Lindsey, from his background, had an appreciation in politics for bullshitters, and so he probably recognized one when he saw it and took that as part of the territory.
Controversial character, interesting character.
Well, he's going to be missed in the Senate, I think, by both sides. The Republicans valued the fact that he did have a direct personal access relationship to Trump, and he worked closely with a number of Democratic senators. If you look at the bipartisan bills and efforts in the Senate, Lindsey was in most of them, and he was a bridge between the two parties. Yes, he had a relationship with Trump, but he was also truly a man of the Senate. And I think there are a number of Democrats who found him really important to achieving bipartisan goals and being able to communicate with Republicans through him. And that will be missed.
So one could say that he practiced the art of the possible.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he would say.
Well, moving on. How much fun was it working with Stephen Colbert? I can't think of another lawyer who ever got a Peabody Award for comedy.
It was a blast, and it was an honor because Stephen Colbert was just whip smart.
Yeah.
And I always told him that if he wanted another career, it might be a little late now, but he would be a great Supreme Court advocate because in arguing before court, but particularly that court, you have to first understand all of the issues. Then you have to find a way to make them clear and simplify them. And in Colbert's case, he could do all of that plus make them funny. And that was a great attribute. Election law can be complicated. I would have fairly long conversations with him about what the state of the law was and what could or couldn't be done, and because he was trying to figure out where his storyline would be, and can I do this? Could I give it? Would it be disclosed? And I would walk through what the law was, and every once in a while you'd hear this pause, and he'd say, "Really? Now that's interesting." And you knew that he had grabbed the thread and figured out what he could do with the latest loophole I had just told him about in the law. But to make all of that clear in a reasonably short segment, I didn't time it, but I think it was sort of 10 to 12 minutes, and to have the audience engrossed in it and following it, it is close to genius.
He's going to be missed. I'm
Well, as
assuming,
you say, he got the Peabody because the view of the judges was he had done a better job than anyone else, and this was confirmed by an Annenberg study out of the University of Pennsylvania in explaining our campaign finance system to people. Annenberg had looked at the level of knowledge about dark money and super PACs between readers of the major newspapers, viewers of the evening news, and Colbert viewers. And the Colbert viewers had a much better understanding because they had followed this narrative through the whole process.
bringing it down to simple. And as you say, funny. I'm sure we'll see him again doing something.
I expect so. We'll all wonder what it will be.
He's too good to retire to the farm. The late breaking news yesterday, I guess, that the DOJ is pulling back on prosecuting corporate crime. Have you heard that?
I think we've seen it for a year and a half, very clearly, across the board. They're approving mergers that their merger experts argued should be fought. They're settling cases, including Trump's case against the IRS, that their lawyers said should be fought and they could win. And in the corporate side, they've dialed back on openly saying they're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act against U.S. companies. And Trump has been busy pardoning people who had been convicted, or in some cases had not yet been convicted and were just being tried for illegal, corrupt corporate activity. So it's pretty clear that there is a green light out of the department on, in general, corruption by American companies and illegal activity by executives of companies. What the article says is that they have increasingly been declining to prosecute corporate officials on a criminal basis for activities they took, or to prosecute the corporation itself as being responsible for the activities by their executives. It I think is a general turn of the department, made perhaps more obvious by the fact the department has lost a lot of good lawyers who have resigned or been fired, so that estimates are 25% of their workforce has left. And so they are perhaps under-equipped to deal with some of these complicated cases. Here at my organization, Campaign Legal Center, we are lucky to have been the landing place for a couple of those top Justice Department lawyers who know how the system works and are now helping us defend the rule of law, since they're no longer doing that at Justice.
You tell us about what you're doing now. You've led into it. It's interesting.
Well, we're a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, and historically we have worked on ensuring the freedom to vote, so the area of voting rights, absentee ballots, voter registration, voter ID, voter rolls, to ensure that people who are legally qualified have access to vote. Then we've worked hard against gerrymandering and had some significant success in helping states create independent commissions and defending those. And then money in politics, which is really where we got our start, helping defend the McCain-Feingold law, transparency of money in politics, appropriate limits, public financing systems as an alternative, and then government ethics, fighting corruption in government. Those are the areas that we've traditionally worked in, and for the last year and a half we have added defense of the rule of law, defense of the First Amendment, separation of powers, in response to the activity we've been seeing by this administration, which we think in many cases violates the law, statutes, or violates the Constitution. And so, for instance, in that area, we have been representing a number of states, both red and blue states, that are opposing the administration's requests for voter lists on the basis that the federal government doesn't have authority to ask for those, that elections are run by the states, not the federal government, that those lists contain confidential information, including social security numbers and other personal identifying information, that the states shouldn't be handing over to another entity, even if it is the federal government.
What are they going to do with that information?
What they'd like to do is to assemble a national voter list of persons who are eligible to vote, which first we think violates existing law, but secondly changes our election system, because the Constitution says that states run elections unless Congress intervenes by law and changes the time, place, or manner. And so this is an attempt not provided for in the Constitution to federalize our election system. And there are a couple problems with that. One is it makes it more vulnerable to fraud. In an electronic age, it makes it more likely that a single federal list could be hacked or damaged by a foreign adversary or someone who wanted to intervene in our elections. It's much harder to do if you have 50 such lists at the state, and each of those comes from cities and counties, so it is diffused and dispersed. But there is a risk, if you had a single federal list, that it could be hacked. There's also a real risk that it could be used for partisan purposes, and that's what the states worry about. Their additional worry is that it's going to be inaccurate, because what the administration says it's trying to do is to take the state databases, create a federal list of voters, and then compare it with other federal databases, including ones that in theory would tell the government whether somebody was a citizen or not. And the problem is that that creates inaccuracies instantly. There is not a good federal database that would tell you who's in this country as a citizen and who is here on a visa or otherwise. What happens is somebody comes, they enter, they get a green card, which means they're not a citizen, but they're legally here and can work, and then following the legal procedures, they become a citizen. They are naturalized. And yet the federal database often doesn't reflect that. So what we've seen in the past is that some states have tried to compare information they have through immigration and green card lists with their voter lists and say, we have all these people on here who are not citizens and not allowed to vote. And those people turn up saying, I'm a citizen. Here's my naturalization certificate. The lists are not accurate enough to create a database that tells you accurately whether someone is or is not a citizen if they're on a voter list. And so the worry is you will have a inaccurate federal list subject to potential fraud and hacking. And that's what the administration is heading towards, or would like to head towards, but they don't have it. And in part, they don't have it because states are saying, we're not going to give you our confidential voter lists.
And that'll hold, do you think?
Well, so far, every court that has considered it has said that the federal government does not have the right to demand these lists. That's different than whether states can voluntarily give them the list, which would be a matter in some cases of state law. But that's the beginning of the game. I think there are 14 different judges who have all come out the same way, but those will be appealed up in the circuits, and you may find a circuit that disagrees, and so this could ultimately, over time, end up at the Supreme Court. But so far, the states have been able to argue for principles of federalism and for the constitutional remand of power to elections to the states.
This thing that happened in New Jersey probably isn't helping the cause.
It's not, although I think the fact that they were transparent about it, that they found it themselves, and that the numbers are so small.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about 400 individuals out of the millions of people who vote in New Jersey. As a percentage, it's infinitesimal. And it wasn't, as far as we can tell, in any sense deliberate. It was the state vendor that inaccurately took names and put them on the voter list, even though the individuals had checked a box saying they were not a citizen. So it's, to some extent, the state accidentally enabled this, but at a very small number of people, and found it itself and have rectified it. And that's how we want the system to work. We want the states to be looking carefully at their lists and correcting mistakes when they find them. If you were to try to scale that up to a national level, I think you'd have far more mistakes in identifying potential non-citizen voters if you do it at a national scale rather than state by state.
Still, Trump will use it. How far do you think Trump is going to go to pervert the midterms, and are we prepared?
It's clear that since he got into office, his goal has been to assume what I think is an unconstitutional control over the election process. The list we've been talking about is only one aspect of that. For whatever reason, he disagrees with the states, which is to say almost all, who allow absentee voting and early voting if citizens want it. It used to be you had to have an excuse to vote in advance or by mail, and partly because of COVID and partly because citizens demanded more convenience, almost every state has moved to a system where you can ask for and get an absentee ballot. There are 5 states that actually vote by mail, so they send their registered voters ballots, which they return by mail or in person. So for whatever reason, Trump has identified that as a method of voting that he doesn't like.
Yeah, why?
Well, slightly odd because that's how he votes. When he was in New York, he voted by mail. When he's in Florida, he votes by mail. And when asked about that at a press conference, he huffed and puffed and said, well, I'm different. I'm president. I'm very busy. And I think the reality is most citizens who vote by mail feel they're busy, and this is a convenient way for them to vote. And they're sure they voted in advance, not knowing what election day will bring. The background here is interesting because I know, as a former Republican election lawyer working for the first President Bush and dealing closely with the RNC, that absentee vote by mail used to be a Republican somewhat secret weapon. They spent tens of millions of dollars building lists of voters to whom absentee ballots could go. They knew they were registered Republicans, they were reliable voters, and they would do what they called banking those votes ahead of the election, so that if it rained on election day or someone didn't feel well, they didn't need to worry about turnout, they'd already voted. And so this has traditionally been something that the Republican Party has favored. But Trump has been on a rampage against it, and it turns out that his actions have created a partisan differential that didn't used to be there. Used to be Republicans really pushed this, then Democrats realized this was a good idea, they began to push for it. But when we then saw Trump come out against it and say, it's fraudulent, it's dangerous, don't do it, we saw a significant drop in the percentage of Republicans who voted in advance or by mail. Pursuant to what they thought were Trump's instructions, they waited and voted on election day. Meanwhile, the Democrats were pushing early voting, absentee voting, particularly during COVID, afraid that people would be scared to go to a polling place and be around other people. And so we began to see this change where more Democrats voted in advance or by mail and fewer Republicans, which now means that when Trump says this is unfair, the Democrats have this advantage, he is pointing to a reality he has created where the early votes tend to be more Democratic, the mail-in votes when they're counted are more Democratic, and what happens on election day is more Republican. And that creates this perception that on election night in a state like Pennsylvania, you're getting the machine totals voted on election day immediately, and they often show a Republican lead. Then they start counting the absentee votes, the early votes by mail, and it shifts. And Trump says, see, I told you, something's happening in the middle of the night while we're asleep. I went to bed, the Republicans were ahead, I woke up, the Democrats are ahead. What's going on? So he's developed it as a weapon to challenge the legitimacy of election results he doesn't like. We're all familiar with the 2020 election and his allegations that he won despite all the investigations and the audits afterwards. But you didn't hear any of that in 2024. Same system of voting, same absentee. Since he won, there were no complaints about it. So what he's created is a mechanism by which he can object to results, and the party can, that he doesn't like, and claim it's fraudulent because they were mail-in or they were received after the election, even though state law allows that if they are legally cast and voted mailed before. And then, of course, again, on a selective basis, depending on the results, there are these claims that somehow the machines were fiddled with or results were changed. So we have all of this coming from the administration, laying the groundwork, I think, for a challenge to election results to the midterm if they don't like how things have come out.
Well, that's what I was getting at. I know that there are people gaming what he could do, and just how far he could go, and let's think of the craziest things he could possibly do and be prepared. But do you think we're actually prepared?
As a country, I think we are more and more aware of the challenges that could be made to the election process. And yes, there are groups like mine at Campaign Legal Center that are thinking through what the challenges could be, what problems he could create. I'd say back in 2020, we did the same thing, came up with a long list of what we regarded as reasonably crazy possibilities for interfering with the election. And all of those crazy possibilities actually ended up occurring, including challenges to the counting of electoral votes in Congress. So we had thought that those things were unlikely, but had prepared for them. Now, I think we think they're likely. That the things we have seen, whether it is trying to seize voting machines, which Trump has said he wished he had done in 2020, and the Justice Department had told him he had no authority. This Justice Department is not going to tell him he has no authority. He's already seized voting machines in Georgia and tried to seize voting lists in Michigan as a way of relitigating the 2020 loss, but I think also laying the groundwork for trying to do such things in the midterm. So if you look at the scale of possibilities, one would be significant civic unrest. I think you could see a scenario where ICE forces are sent in, as we have seen in Minneapolis and Los Angeles and elsewhere, and the result of that is communities rise up and follow ICE and try to protect people, and that can create disturbances and unrest. That would be an excuse to say, now we're going to send in troops to put down this unrest, all of which would, of course, affect potentially the ability of people to vote on election day. It's not that the polls are closed, but if you have battles in the streets, it would make it harder for people to vote or feel safe voting. So you have that in advance. We've already seen the gerrymandering in a number of states increasing through legal means, legislation, the number of safe Republican seats. And then you have the possibility of challenges to absentee ballots, even though the Supreme Court has upheld the right of states to receive ballots after the election if that's allowed under state law, and they're cast beforehand and postmarked beforehand. He has objected to that and said it's wrong, and he has issued a executive order prohibiting that. That executive order has no legal effect, but it has a PR effect. Campaign Legal Center went to court and got an injunction against that order because the president doesn't have the authority to change state law in this regard. But that doesn't mean he won't be out there saying it violates my executive order and it's fraudulent. And then you can see challenges to the results of elections, attempts to get governors or secretaries of state in Republican states not to certify Democratic winners, and potentially to object to the certifications going to Congress. So I think it is possible there will be legal battles on all of these fronts, and governors, secretaries of states, election officials now are on notice that these are possibilities, and I think are focused on what they would do if it occurred in their states. A feature of this, of course, is that it's not a presidential election, so we're not talking about a handful of target states, of battleground states. We're talking about congressional districts all over the country, where there might be a Democratic district in a very Republican state. Texas is a Republican state with Republican election officials, and yet Democrats are going to win some House seats in Texas. We don't know what will happen in the Senate contest in Texas. And so you could see the possibility of the administration trying to basically influence and shift results after the voters have voted, claiming that those results shouldn't be accepted. And I think in those circumstances, you will see immediate legal challenges, both by the political parties, but also by groups like ours defending the public interest and the integrity of the voting system.
I must say the courts have held. I'm a little embarrassed for corporate America. I'm a bit embarrassed for academia and some law firms, but the courts, minus the Supreme Court, I suppose, have by and large held. Give me the bottom line. Are we going to have a free and fair election, or is there is there a chance that he could actually get away with it?
Well, we have to fight for a free and fair election. We have to defend the integrity of our election system. And I think election officials across the country are prepared to do that. And outside organizations are prepared to help them with that.
Yeah.
You and I both entered politics at an era where this conversation would be unthinkable. The candidates for both parties honored the election results.
Yeah.
I don't remember it, but I've certainly read of Richard Nixon conceding to John Kennedy. Nixon was urged to challenge that result. The argument was that either there was potential fraud or very close counts in Texas and Illinois, and Nixon shouldn't concede. And he said, I can't do that to the country. That would harm us in the eyes of the world. And he gave a very gracious concession speech. We all saw Al Gore concede in a state which he thought he had won, with an ongoing recount stopped by the Supreme Court. And Gore said, I congratulate President-elect George W. Bush and will do everything I can to be helpful to him. The system held, and the candidates accepted the results even though they didn't like them. There's a wonderful line of a candidate who said, the people have spoken, the bastards. But that was the view, that you waited for the next election. You didn't relitigate the old one, unless it was really close and there was evidence of fraud of some sort or confusion. But states have ways of dealing with that. They have recount processes. They have audits. And every once in a while you get a really close election decided by a couple of votes. And that's a system that I think people have trusted. It's transparent. You know what's happening. There are observers of both parties present. What we're seeing now is different in the sense that the leader of one of the parties and much of the party apparatus are essentially saying it's only legitimate if we win. And if we don't win, we're going to say it's fraudulent. We're going to cast doubts on the result. We're not going to accept them. And that's not a way you can run a democracy, where the elections are only regarded as legitimate if one side wins. And so that's what really is I think, at stake in this election, is being able to make sure that it's free and fair and the results are respected.
Let me give you a theoretical. Providing the Democrats take at least the House, how far should they go?
Well, one of the worries I have is that if the Democrats take the House, the expectation of all those voters for the Democrats will be that somehow things have significantly changed and the course of government and the ability to stop Trump, it will be different. That will be the expectation. The reality is one house of Congress, particularly the House of Representatives, has very limited powers acting on its own. Legislation has to pass the House and the Senate, be signed by the president, or you have to override a presidential veto. It seems unlikely the Democrats would have a supermajority in the House to override a veto. You would still need to override it in the Senate. The Senate is responsible for confirming federal judges and executive branch officials, not the House. What the House can do is play an active role through the budget process, through authorizations, but that can lead to deadlock, as we've seen, where you can't pass a federal budget or you can't authorize the government to do anything, and it selectively shuts down. But that's a negotiating posture. What is it you're going to get out of it? It's not unilateral power. What the House can do is hold hearings, subpoena people, publicly hold the administration to account. And we know from the last time this happened that individuals can be convicted of contempt of Congress. But even there, you normally would have the Justice Department prosecuting, and so you'd be in another deadlock where Congress would be finding someone in contempt, but the Justice Department might likely not be proceeding. So the risk here is that if you have a Democratic House, it will not be as effective as people will think in changing the course of governmental activity, and every single move will have to be a head-butting negotiation to try to have the House play its constitutional role in a world where Trump has very little respect, from the way he's demonstrated and acted, for Congress's role at all. And who ends up refereeing that? Again, arguably the courts do, unless they say this is too political a question, in which case they may duck the inter-branch fights.
It's going to be tempting.
It's not going to be easy.
It's going to be tempting for the Democrats to go for it, but it could backfire.
One of the questions is, would the House again impeach the president? There's certainly lots of things that he has done, that he would admit he has done, that violated the law, or that are pretty flagrant. But if you have an impeachment by the House, and you know the Senate is not going to convict because of the requirement of 67 votes in the Senate, have you accomplished anything with a third impeachment? And that's a question the Democrats will have to think about in terms of what's their best way of exercising their constitutional responsibilities. I think what we've learned over time, and certainly over the last administration, is that impeachment can be a very blunt weapon that at the end consumes a lot of time, but doesn't change the dynamic or the power equation if the president has sufficient support in the Senate. And so then the question becomes, what else can we do that is a better use of our time and our powers?
Yeah, and the people who are already disgusted are going to say, more of the same. You're just as bad as they were.
Well, I mean, if there is a Democratic House, that will reflect a view by the country that, by a majority of the country, that they don't like what's been going on. So the question becomes, how can the House change that, and where can they be effective? I think you're right that the country would like to see the two parties cooperate in Congress, but there you get to the fact that Congress has become more polarized quite visibly over time. It used to be that there was a fair amount of overlap in the center, where you had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans working together, and indeed you had Republicans who were more liberal than some Democrats. That's gone. Now the parties are much more representative of their bases, and because of the primary system and gerrymandering, you see the members of Congress of both parties being closer to their bases, more partisan, more suspicious of working across the aisle, more afraid of being attacked in a primary. If they do become centrist and try to work across the aisle, they'll be accused of not being partisan enough.
Washington, in his farewell address, as you know, warned us against the two-party system. And here we are.
Well, he warned us against it. The founders thought they had created a system that wouldn't have parties, factions, as they called them. And they warned quite accurately that the problem with political parties is that they would seek their own success and to better their prospects at the expense of the public good. That parties would end up doing things that they thought would benefit them personally and as an entity, rather than worrying about the public good. I mean, John McCain campaigned saying country over party. And that is a rare view nowadays. There's a on the public record case out of North Carolina when the Republican legislature gerrymandered and changed the map to benefit the Republicans. And there was a public trial in which the North Carolina legislator in charge was asked how this map benefited the public good. And his answer was, well, I'm a Republican, and I believe our policies are the best policies for the country, and therefore, by having more Republicans, I am, by definition, benefiting the public good. And so you really turned a definition of the public good on its head, which is exactly, as you point out, what the founders feared, warned us against, where parties would legislate for their own good rather than for the good of their states or the country.
They couldn't have seen social media coming, but they sure had human nature right.
That's correct.
And speaking about human nature, I want to move on to the court. Over the last 2 decades, the 9 sitting justices accepted at least 344 gifts worth almost $3 million. And when you add gifts to justices who left the bench since 2004, the total climbs to 546 gifts worth $4.76 million. According to Fix the Court and Courthouse News, only 2 justices, David Souter and John Paul Stevens, reported 100% of what they received. And then we get to Clarence Thomas. He's a single-handed 103 gifts, $2.4 million disclosed, but likely well over $4.2 million once the undisclosed trips are finally counted.
Well, there you're very much in the question of who will police the police.
Yeah.
The problem is the court is not accountable to anybody, any other group, which is untrue of other federal judges. I mean, as you know, the court, under public pressure, announced that it would abide by a code of ethics, which would require the reporting of gifts and so forth. But there's no enforcement mechanism, unlike for other federal judges. If there's a question,
Yeah.
other judges deal with that, and the judicial conference or circuit courts can step in, but there is no mechanism to ensure that the Supreme Court justices follow this code other than on a voluntary basis, which we don't have any other ethics rules that are voluntary. And there have been proposals that I think were perfectly workable to have a ethics group of federal judges coming out of the circuit courts, one from each circuit, something like that, that could at least on an advisory basis point out shortcomings or make interpretations of the ethics rules for the Supreme Court. And the court has declined to do that. So in that sense, they really do view themselves at the moment accurately as above the law and above the rules, and that's not true of anybody else in the other branches of government.
I want to get on to one of your favorite subjects, money and politics, but before we leave the court, should we increase the court to 13, given that there are 13 appellate districts, and should there be term limits?
I think starting with term limits, that makes very good sense. If nothing else, the founders in establishing lifetime tenure and trying to ensure that judges therefore could be independent, didn't expect people to go on at in their 30s or 40s and be there for 40 years. And that's an effect of our current system, is to push for younger and younger justices on the theory they'll be there longer. I think being there that long is fundamentally not good. People over time are very insulated on the court, and you lose touch with what's happening in society, and you end up out of touch with the world. There's nothing partisan about having term limits if they're implemented correctly. The idea of every president being able to appoint one or two justices means it will depend on the parties, and of course you'd still have to have Senate confirmation. So I think the idea of term limits, of a 15-year term or something like that, makes very good sense. The debate is, how can you accomplish that? Can you do it by law, saying you're not limiting someone's tenure, you're leaving them as a federal judge, but they're just not on the Supreme Court, which is what happens usually when a justice retires. They don't go away. They instead remain a federal judge, and they can sit on cases in the lower courts when their work is needed. So you could continue to pay them, but have them then sit on cases in the circuit courts. So that's an argument. You could do it by statute. The other way is, of course, to have a constitutional amendment. Then you have no question about whether it's effective, but that's a harder, longer process to do. In terms of numbers, 9 is not a magic number. The court has moved back and forth over time. I do think it would be a problem to increase the size of the court solely to change its ideological composition. Because if you do that, the argument is then when Congress changes and the president changes, they'll just change the size of the court again to reflect their ideology. And ideally, you want a non-ideological court that is deciding cases based on the law and the Constitution, and justices are not there because of their particular partisan views. So, size, I think, is less important than the way that's done, and whether it is seen as trying to pack the court, as Roosevelt did. But the term limits would be certainly, I think you can say, would not be a partisan outcome. And it would, of course, take time to take effect. There are other things Congress can do, though, and I think is going to look at doing if there's a Democratic Congress, in terms of the court's jurisdiction, in terms of clarifying some of the laws where the court has said that Congress didn't mean what the statutes appear to say. They can go back and say, yes, we did mean that. Ultimately, Congress has options to overturn Supreme Court decisions unless they are based firmly on the Constitution. And even there, in cases involving, say, the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, Congress would have the option of repassing laws based on a new factual record, based on the powers they are explicitly given in the Constitution under the 14th Amendment, to make laws necessary to implement that, and say to the court, you need to think again because we have thought this through and we are exercising our constitutional powers. That is not something that Congress has routinely done, but they could as a way of pointing out to the court that they are not the only branch of government that has the right to interpret the Constitution.
Well, I mean, as you know, the founders intended Congress to be the most powerful of the three branches of government, but Congress seems to have just gone AWOL.
Well, part of that is the partisanship we see. I mean, I actually was in Washington as Congress was challenging Richard Nixon and went through that impeachment process in the House. And Congress thought of itself as an independent branch of government, not the Republicans in Congress in particular thought they had responsibilities to their voters, to their states, to their constitutional role, and they weren't supposed to be subservient to a president who was acting in illegal or unconstitutional ways. And that's what we've lost, where whichever party has the White House now assumes that the members of Congress of that party will follow the president wherever he goes. And that is not what the founders expected. They gave Congress more power than the president because the president was simply supposed to execute the laws, and Congress got to decide what the laws were. Plus, of course, famously decide on spending, decide on whether to go to war or not. And you're right, we are not seeing Congress asserting its constitutional responsibilities today. And we're not going to, I think, so long as members of Congress think of themselves solely as Republicans and Democrats responsible to their party leader, rather than what the founders thought, which is representing their citizens, their voters, and their states, and asserting their constitutional responsibilities when the executive branch was wrong.
Well, it throws the whole delicate system of checks and balances out of whack.
It does, and it leaves you in a very impractical place, which is Congress's only true power ends up being to impeach the president and throw them out. And that's a power that historically it has been unable to exercise because of the supermajority it requires. And it's not good for the country to have Congress's ultimate power be simply to impeach the president and remove them from office. You want Congress to have the power to legislate, to determine spending, to determine when our armed forces are going to be in combat or not, because Congress represents the people at large, and frankly, having 535 heads looking at these issues is better than having one head look at these issues.
Well, throughout Trump's career before he was president, he's made his business to thumb his nose at the courts and at authority and systems and whatnot. But Congress has no real way of enforcing their power, do they?
Well, they do if they are willing to stand up to the president, and this goes again to the partisan nature of this. The Republican majorities in the House and the Senate are unwilling to enforce their power. If you had Democratic majorities, they could certainly hold hearings, demonstrate what the activities are of the executive that are not permitted. They could subpoena witnesses to testify. They could find people in contempt of Congress if they refuse to testify or to have perjured themselves in a criminal way if they lied while testifying. So they could hold the executive publicly accountable. And then, of course, again, if there were a majority that were willing to do it, and thus in our current environment, a Democratic majority, they could put provisions in the authorization bills prohibiting the executive from spending money in certain ways or ordering them to spend money in other ways. And then you'd end up in a situation where perhaps the president vetoes those bills. Can you override the veto? Or can Congress force a compromise where some of that becomes law? So there are things Congress could do, but the current partisan majorities in the House and the Senate don't want to do those things. And so the question under our system with midterm elections coming up is, does that change if there are different partisan majorities? And how does, if there were Democratic majorities, how do they then go about exercising that power in a way that citizens think is legitimate and not simply more partisan warfare?
Big question. I'd like to move on just for a second before we run completely out of time. Speaking about things that have gone wildly off the rails, money and politics. Tell me about it.
It's pretty remarkable. We've gone in our lifetimes from a system of limits to what people can give to candidates and party committees and full disclosure to a system with essentially no limits and corporate and union money spent legally, openly in elections, and the possibility of spending money without any disclosure. So we've gone to the Wild West, and we've gone to the possibility, which has become the reality, of billionaires essentially buying elections, billionaires spending unlimited sums to elect their favored candidates, who indisputably are then beholden to, grateful to their billionaire sponsors, and afraid of irritating them. I mean, you have to remember there are two sides to this. One is the corruption and appearance of corruption when someone spends a huge amount to elect a candidate who then appears to be in their pocket. But you have the other side, which is somebody with vast wealth, a special interest, saying, if you don't vote for this bill, or if you do vote for that bill, I'm going to defeat you. I'm going to spend an unlimited amount of secret money to run ads. No one will know it's me, and they're going to attack you. Probably not on whatever the actual issue is that the billionaire objects to, but claiming you are, pro-Russian, pro-Chinese, against the police, whatever it is that they think will resonate with voters, and the voters won't know why this money is being spent or who's spending it in many cases.
It's pretty scary.
There are ways to fix it, but that's where we are at the moment.
I was about to ask you. We need campaign finance reform, and the Supreme Court sort of put the banana peel under that, right?
Well, they have put it under limits in a number of ways. Most recently, their case in June, telling the party committees that they can spend an unlimited amount in coordination with their candidates, which those of us who filed briefs on the other side said the problem with that is the party committees just become a big pass-through, and somebody can give hundreds of thousands to these joint fundraising party committees and designate it informally, not earmark it legally, but say, I want it spent on this Senate race or that Senate race. We're going to see that, I think, in some of the states this year. Texas, the Republican nominee is widely disliked by Republican donors in Texas, and they have not been funding him. But now the National Party will be able to come in with money from all over and from people who want to affect control of the Senate and spend money on behalf of that candidate and essentially give it to their campaign through coordinated spending. So we're seeing that, and the Supreme Court has made those rules unenforceable or have said they're unconstitutional. But the court has not prohibited transparency. In fact, in Citizens United, Justice Kennedy famously wrote, yes, we're going to allow corporate spending, but it won't be a problem because it will be fully disclosed and shareholders will be able to hold their corporates, the corporations they hold stock in, accountable, and citizens will know who is spending money and speaking to them. It hasn't worked out that way, but it could. And constitutionally, the court has so far upheld transparency requirements when they do exist. The Campaign Legal Center worked very hard to create a model statute of transparency for secret spending, so-called dark money, and that was approved by the voters in Arizona for state elections and was challenged in court, both state court and federal court, and the courts have upheld that transparency. So the ads have to identify who the major funders are of the ads or the spending they're seeing. So that could be done in other states. It could be done by Congress if there were a majority willing to pass those kind of disclosure laws.
I have a zillion other questions I want to ask you, and I want to get you back for all those other questions I have, but I have a couple of more before you go. I think, why shouldn't we have liar laws for politicians? We have laws for lying under oath, lying to the FBI, lying to investors. Why can't we pass liar laws for politicians when they knowingly lie to us?
Well, the risk there, of course, is the factual question of did they knowingly lie to us, and will it chill political speech if, when a candidate says something, they are then prosecuted by a prosecutor of the other party? You then end up in a potentially criminal trial over what you knew, whether you knew what you said was false, how false was it, all of those issues. And so, while you're right, there are a number of laws the courts have upheld, including claims of false claims of military honors, which the court has said can be prosecuted. But so far, the courts have been reluctant to extend that to political debate, on the basis that political debate is at the very core of the First Amendment, unlike some of those other areas, and thus that ought to be as protected and robust as possible. Not that they want lies out of candidates and public officials, but generally the courts have said the cost of ascertaining that it's a lie and prosecuting it would be the chilling of political debate. So that's the balance question there.
Other countries are toying with it, I know, and I can't remember which they are, but other countries are thinking about it. It just
other countries have a range of laws that we don't have. And other countries have free speech, but they interpret their free speech requirements differently than ours. England limits to reasonably small amounts how much individual candidates can spend, and they say political spending needs to be done by the parties through publicly disclosed contributions, not by individuals and outsiders. That's a different approach to running elections. It's one that our Supreme Court has said violates our First Amendment, but it doesn't violate the equivalent free speech guarantees in countries like England or Canada.
So all the things we've been talking about add up to a frightening statistic. And I think it came out of the Annenberg study, if I'm not mistaken. Only 39% of millennials and Gen Zers, who will represent over 50% of the vote in the 2028 election, 39% of them are, only 39% of them are convinced that living in a democracy is essential. To me, coming from a different generation, that statistic just freaks me out.
Well, it reminds me of the great Winston Churchill line, which is democracy is the worst form of government invented, except every other one that's been tried. And I think that statistic you cite reflects the fact that Generation Z doesn't know other forms of government. They've not had that experience. People who went through the Second World War and saw what fascism looked like all over Europe, or the Cold War and saw what communism did in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, understood that the freedom to speak, the freedom to protest, the ability to vote for your representatives in Washington was a much better system of government and worth fighting for. But today you see fewer of those examples. Most people don't understand or see the authoritarianism present in, say, Russia or China or Iran. And so to them, they're looking at it and saying, I don't like the results. And that is a problem with democracies, is that if citizens say the government isn't doing enough, or it's doing too much, or it's doing the wrong things, there's a sense, well, if only we had a strong man in charge, they could make things happen and do the right things, rather than have to negotiate and accommodate other points of view. You lose all of your rights in that sort of a system. The government can arbitrarily arrest you or prosecute you or jail you for what you said or didn't say. But people who haven't experienced that system look at it from the other end of the telescope and say, maybe the results will be different if we were run by a general or a strong man who could make all the decisions. History tells us that's not true. Economists tell us, interestingly, that the more authoritarian a government is, the lower the economic growth rates, because it stifles innovation and makes decisions that are in the interests of the people in charge, not necessarily of the whole country. But again, that's not a personal experience, fortunately, that Americans have had in this country until now.
Yeah, but the interesting, another Annenberg result is that we're living in a nation of civically illiterate people, because we've essentially started deleting the teaching of civics and American history back in the mid-'60s from our curriculum. I think that study also said that 70%, I think is the number, 70% of us couldn't pass the immigration test that immigrants have to take to become citizens. And a friend of mine who is a professor at the University of Chicago teaches a graduate class, and he says that the kids come in at the beginning of the year, and he says, tell me what you think about the system. Tell me, give me your thoughts. You angry? You like it? You think good, bad, what? And they go on. They are angry. And they keep saying, well, the system isn't working. Education is a problem. Healthcare is a problem. Politics is a problem. Supreme Court's a problem. Nothing but problems. Why are we defending a system that isn't working? And he says, I let them talk. And at the end of when they run out of air, I say, okay, I get it. You're angry at the system. Tell me what you know about the system. Well, they don't know anything about the system, like almost zero. And that has to be a genetic problem right now. And again, the Annenberg, what's her name? The woman who runs the Annenberg, directed the Annenberg study, said something like, it would be foolish to suppose that a people will continue to support and passionately defend something that they don't understand and know almost nothing about. Which leads me to my
very good line.
And it's a frightening line, but which leads me to my very last question before I ask you to come back so I can ask you about 25 more. My last question is, we made it to 250. What do you think the odds are we'll make it to 350 with the idea of America more or less intact?
Well, part of the answer to that is the point you were making about people understanding our system of government and people being well enough educated to be able to make informed decisions. I mean, one of the things that we see looking back at the founders is that they understood that in order for a republic to work, which included the democratic element of people voting for Congress and voting for local leaders, in order to make it work, they had to be educated. And so Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. George Washington talked about founding a national university. We very quickly had West Point and Annapolis as training for the military. And then you had this whole push throughout the 19th century for land-grant colleges and local education. And that became important as the number of people who could vote and the nature of that increased, because the founders thought you had to have an educated electorate to make it work. And so as the franchise was widened to non-property owners and then to black males after the Civil War and then to women, it became equally important that educational opportunities be there so that the voters understood the issues, what they were voting on, and how the system worked, which is why we had civics education. And you're right, we now don't have civics taught in the schools in many cases. Sandra Day O'Connor, the former Supreme Court Justice, made her whole career after the court pushing for civics education precisely so people would understand three branches of government, separation of powers, why the system works the way it does, how it ought to be improved. You can't talk about reforms and improvement if you don't understand what's there now. And so the question, are we going to be here in 100 years as a democracy, I think to a great extent depends on, can we bring education back, can we bring civics back to a level that people are engaged and understand how the system is supposed to work. And that's going to require a push by government at all levels, and that starts with the sort of information you've been giving us that says we have a problem and we need to address it.
Yeah. I guess I'm optimistic. I like people marching in the streets. Protesters and protests have been behind every major improvement that we've made in this country from the very beginning. Otherwise, we'd all be singing "God Bless the King" if it weren't for the original protesters. So I guess I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic, but worried, very worried. Trevor, this has been a great pleasure. I want to invite you back, and I hope you'll come back. And in the meantime, thank you for spending this time with us. It's been great.
Thank you, Martin. It's great to have this conversation. I, too, am optimistic. That's what the Campaign Legal Center is all about, is working to protect and improve our republic and our democracy. So it's glad to have a chance to talk about these issues with you.
We can't stop believing.
Right. And working.
And working. Take care and have a good rest of the week.
Thanks so much.